Welcome. Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Wendy Schiller, and I'm the Interim Director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, also the Director of the Taubman Center, and we are co-sponsoring this event together. And I'm also the Allison S. Ressler Professor of Political Science. There's also plenty of seats up front, and then you can always leave early if you need to. You don't have to worry about sitting up front. We are really so fortunate tonight to have folks who've been looking at questions of polling and public opinion and political behavior and institutional responses to elections, particularly in the United States Senate. So we have our three panelists, Professor Paul Testa in the Political Science Department, who's an expert on public opinion and polling. And we have the next up, so we'll go in order of presentation, Professor Marquez Zarate, who is a specialist in political behavior and Latino politics. And then we have Professor Richard Arenberg, so many of you have taken his classes, who had a long time career in the United States Senate. And then we have been very lucky to have him be a professor appointed jointly in the Political Science Department and the Watson Institute. So the run of show today will be that we will have each presenter take up to 10 minutes for their thoughts and their take on the election. And then I might ask one or two questions, depending on all that they've covered. And then we will open it up to questions from the audience. We may just take the mics and pass them around instead of having people get up, but we'll see what we can do. And there's a lot to say. I do want to say that the Taubman Center will be devoting its Monday Politics and Policy lunch this coming Monday, November 11th, Veterans Day, to breaking down the election as well. And we have an open event on December 2nd at noon in the Joukowsky Forum in the other building from 12 to 1. That'll be open to the public and open to students. And that will be a sort of really a look ahead to the now that Kamala Harris has conceded, a second Trump administration. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Professor Paul Testa to come up.
Thanks so much, Wendy, and thank you all for being here on an important night. My goal for today is to talk to you about four questions. What happened? Why did it happen? What have we learned? With a particular focus on what have we learned about polling in presidential elections, and then a few thoughts on what comes next. So what happened? Briefly, I think we're all fairly familiar with the outcomes of last night. Trump won the presidency with roughly, a maximum 312 electoral votes to 226. Republicans flipped the Senate. Again, the sort of majority there is still to be determined, but between a 51 and 56 seat majority. And then the House is still in play. I think we probably won't know for a couple of days, maybe next week. California counts its votes relatively so. I think if there's one sort of figure that is probably in Democrats' nightmares and Republicans' dreams, it's this figure from the New York Times, this red shift. Right? If you think about the sort of outcome of the election across counties, across the U.S., just a dramatic shift from 2020 to 2024 in the direction of Donald Trump. And this is true across a range of counties, right? So if we look at counties that Trump won by a lot, counties that Biden won, again, Trump is outperforming his 2020 margins by significant percentage points across a range of demographic considerations. And so this is just a general broad story that sort of leads to then, and I think informs how we think about explanations for why did this happen. We might form that question as, why did Kamala and the Democrats lose? Why did Trump and the Republicans win? However we want to sort of think about these questions, I think it's helpful to also think about what's the sort of implied counterfactual, right? What are we thinking about sort of relative to this? Are we thinking about what would have happened, say, had Biden not run? Had the Democrats had a competitive primary? Are we thinking about what happened, say, if Mitch McConnell had actually sort of decided to convict or hold a trial in the Senate and the Republicans had nominated a different candidate? Had Nikki Haley run? How would the results have been different, right? Sometimes when I think about these explanations, it's helpful to think like, would Democrats have lost no matter what? Would they have potentially done better had they run a different campaign? Had they enacted different policies? Had they responded to COVID-19 and the pandemic and the recession in a different way? I think these are helpful as we sort of think about and evaluate the types of explanations that I think you'll hear in the coming days and weeks. So what are those types of explanations? I think there's a range of things we'll see. I think very often you'll read a lot of very deeply reported and very interesting stories about the campaigns, right? You'll have this sort of insider narratives that will tell you stories about sort of key decisions in the campaigns that either were key blunders or brilliant insights. I will say that my one caveat there is I think like these stories often are sort of told, they have some self-interest in the way they're told. So, well, I think campaigns certainly matter. I think it's not the sole story here, right? I think another type of explanation you'll see, and I think my colleagues will offer some more insight, are sort of a focus on sort of specific groups, right? That Republicans won because they did particularly well among this group of voters, or Democrats failed to reach this group of voters. And again, I think that's a relevant component. I'll show you a little bit of exit polling where we can see some of these trends shortly. But again, I think the story is almost always going to be more complicated, right? Sometimes you'll see stories about sort of the issues of the campaign, right? Is it about immigration, abortion, democracy, crime, culture war issues? Would Democrats have done better or worse had they focused more or less on these types of issues? I would say that, well, issues certainly matter, and we'll see some evidence of this, particularly with the question of abortion. I would also caution against trying to read too much into any one singular issue, right? I think sometimes if we look at sort of outcomes conditional on issues, voters can be maybe more rationalizing than rational, right? That's sometimes the way they interpret these results. Are often sort of on other issues, right? So I think one of the sort of classic explanations I'm sure you will hear is something about it's the economy, stupid, right? James Carville's famous quote about how voters make decisions in elections that has an entire field of sort of retrospective voting that sort of suggests, right, that citizens are influenced by, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And I think that that is an explanation that probably holds some weight. If you think about many voters, the average voter, people who maybe aren't coming to a lecture on a Wednesday night, how are they deciding an election? Are they thinking about, maybe things were probably better before COVID, and I guess I want something like that, right? How is that deciding they're sort of making their decisions? Another type of explanation I think you'll see, right, is that it's actually more about kind of something deeper, right? It's about racism and sexism and transphobia and xenophobia, right? And I think the challenge with all of these explanations, right? Finally, my final explanation is it's something that is more, maybe even more general, right? It's a sort of anti-establishment, it's negative partisanship. All of these things, I think, probably have some truth to it, right? And it's a matter of degree. My only general thought at this point in time, right, is to sort of beware of a singular explanation. Beware of a sort of solo kind of that is purely one of these factors. It's likely all of these factors, and it's often very hard to sort of disentangle, right? Are voters deciding because of the economy? Are sort of attitudes towards race and sex and gender sort of more or less salient because of economic considerations? How do these differ across groups? I think again, this is sort of the work of academics and politicians and citizens in the coming years. And so I would just be cautious about sort of concluding it's one factor and only one factor would be my take. But I'm interested in hearing your particular on all of these aspects, maybe in the Q&A. Briefly, just a few trends in the early exit polling. Again, the sort of caveat I would say is that these margins can and will change. As I was preparing these slides, the margins, say, on the outcomes by age actually differed, actually flipped a little bit. And so again, some caveats waiting. These will be sort of weighted to represent the final results once we have the final results. Overall, I think you see, again, sort of Harris doing better among women, but not necessarily by the margins that Biden did. If we were to,
Oh, sometimes, yeah.
Yeah. The joys of, if you look at this across race, this is, I think, one of the big stories of the election that I will defer to Marcus to talk about, but sort of the trend, particularly among Latino men, supporting Trump at far higher levels than prior. We see further evidence, I think, of some education polarization that Harris tended to do better among college-educated voters, both across race, among whites and blacks. If you're interested in these data, the slides are at polltested.org/slides/election 2024. So you can peruse these at your own interest. Again, some demonstrations, some dynamics by age. Harris tended to do a little bit better among younger voters, but not as well as Biden in 2020, as well as among older voters. And then some further interesting dynamics, again, by age and gender. The other key features, right, that stood out to me, Trump really sort of returned strength in the sort of rural regions. We saw that in that wave of red arrows. And then as well as in sort of If we think about sort of class in 2020, I think these margins were flipped. Trump has done better among sort of middle class, lower class workers, lower income workers. Another feature here that I think would be interesting, right, is that again, Harris does particularly well among folks who think that sort of abortion should be legal in all cases. But the majority of Americans, I think, are often in this kind of more legal in most cases, right? And the margin here declines significantly. There's a lot of information, again, I think like to be interpreted, with some care going forward. Just a few, then moving forward, just a few things about what we've learned. I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. Are the polls fundamentally broken? You're going to hear a long discussion that polls have sort of missed the strength and depth of Trump's support in 3 elections. But if we look at, I suspect by the final counts, the sort of absolute margin will probably be pretty close to historical averages, but there are often battleground states. But again, the sort of forecasts predicting a 50-50 election don't mean exactly 50-50 in every state, right? It's sort of, if there's a traditional error in one way or the other, we could see the kind of outcomes that we saw. And so if you, a poll like the Seltzer-Isla poll missed bigly, but polls that took more aggressive weighting approaches were a little more accurate, but it's unclear that these strategies were really sort of like, were they right out of being correctly representing the population, or were they just sort of lucky? Weighting on past vote, I was one of these sort of new developments that I think actually tended to increase support for Harris. So there's a lot to say about this. If you ask, that said, polls did pick up on some trends that I think we saw in this exit polling: racial depolarization, education polarization, some shifts in party identification. If you ask Jon Stewart, I think he would tell you no, right? I don't know if anyone watched Jon Stewart last night, but I think he was pretty upset with the experts. My take is a little different. Polling is hard, particularly with Trump, with these sort of non-conventional voters. My answer is always relative to what? Right? Can we trust them relative to talking heads and conventional wisdom? I still say yes. Prediction markets, also probably yes. And in part, it's because polls are useful even when they're wrong, right? Because polls give us a criteria to sort of understand and evaluate how it is that they're wrong. What comes next? I'll defer to my colleagues who are much more experts. I think a lot depends on the House, although Congress is biased towards the status quo. I think things like a national abortion ban and 20% tariffs are probably hard to get through legislatively. I would be sort of more focused on the executive branch, where I think there's less oversight, fewer guardrails, more possibility for particular harms, maybe on immigration policy, judicial appointments, civil service, foreign policy. Tempered against kind of that Wall Street Journal editorial type perspective, how much does Trump actually care about governing? How much do the people Trump appoints care about governing? How much does he care about maybe settling some scores? And then lastly, the thing I do want to suggest, right, is that a lot depends on you, right? You're showing up after an election, and these days after an election, right, can either be euphoric if your candidate won, or pretty despondent, right? And I think my goal to convince you, and I'm done, this is the last slide.
No, I like what you're saying.
All right,
it's encouraging.
No, thank you. Well, politics is about power, right? And to wield power, you got to win elections. To win elections, you need to build coalitions of different voters. Building coalitions requires compromise. That's a lot of work, right? And it's a lot of work that often happens at a local level over a long time. I think sometimes like we follow these presidential elections and you feel powerless. You're like, I have no control over these outcomes. You have lots of control, though. You have control over local elections. You have the opportunity to get involved, to run for office, to serve on committees, to sort of canvass. Politics doesn't just happen every 4 years, right? It happens every day. And so I hope that you're like, I totally get it. If you're feeling sick of politics.
No, I would end on politics happens every day. Like, just
engage. Yeah. Thank you, Wendy.
But I want to say thank you so much, Professor Testa. And I think everybody should take a screenshot with their phone of that, what comes next. Because if you are feeling happy about the election or not happy, it will bolster you. Because there are the next days, the next weeks, the next months, the next years. It's just a perfect sort of mantra. So thank you so much for that. Thank you. And now we have Professor Marquez Zarate.
All right, well, thank you all for being here. When I was asked to speak for about 10 minutes, I tried to think of how I could do this without slides, and things weren't coming clear, so I decided to pack them up. And so, similar to what Professor Test was kind of going through, I want to start off with this big picture. And for the most part, we were talking about Latino voters. But before kind of going into that, I want to set the stage that we can't necessarily have a single explanation for how this election turned out. At least on Twitter, and we know Twitter isn't necessarily going to be like representative opinion. We see like a lot of people blaming Latino men and Latinos more generally. But when we look at a map like this, we see that it's not just one demographic group, it's an entire country. And so we can go through different explanations. in the time that I've had since the election was ended, I've kind of been thinking more and more about the economy. But anyways, that's just a close-up of it. Caveats that Professor Testa had, exit polls, they're not necessarily always correct, but they give us some type of situation. So one of the explanations talked about is it's the economy stupid, right? And so inflation was rising. We can make an explanation as to, the US had a good recovery, but compared to other countries, but sometimes it's not feeling that. So if we look at the exit polls based off of whether or not people feel that they're doing better than 4 years ago, it tracks onto how people vote. Now, there's a whole bunch of bias in this. There's some motivated reasoning, but it kind of tracks with this economic story. And so this is just another way of looking at it. Another one of the dominant narratives that we kind of find is that there's a gender gap, and some initial results seems to support this, right? And so we see about 64% of men voting for Donald Trump versus about 54, oh no, it's 54, excuse me. I have terrible eyesight, on either side for either party. So there's a gender explanation. I think one of the more prominent ones I've also been hearing is about an educational gap, where we see that non-college educated individuals tend to be voting more prevalently for Donald Trump versus college educated folks voting for Kamala Harris. And so what I'm going to spend most of the time today, and I just wanted to kind of go through all those before working it up, is the prominent explanation of the role of race, and particularly among Latino men. And so if we look at this exit poll, it shows that Donald Trump received 54% of the Latino male vote. Meanwhile, Kamala Harris received about 61%. And so traditionally, we kind of think that as a marginalized group, that Latinos tend to vote for Democratic politicians. But I think one thing that we've learned from this election is that we can't necessarily take for granted, I guess, how these different marginalized groups kind of vote and how they think about politics. We can't just assume that they're going to vote one way or another. And oftentimes their attitudes and opinions are a lot more sophisticated. So for the rest of the presentation, I'll be kind of talking about the seeming shift that's happened now twice in a row of Latinos towards the Republican Party. And again, I just want to go, we can't just place it on one group. This was a nationwide thing. Let's kind of go ahead into the details. And so I don't have systematic evidence, but when I was following the campaign, I noticed that Kamala Harris tried to reach out to Latinos in a few different ways. And so if you look at her campaign advertisements in Arizona, she primarily focused on how she's a daughter of immigrant, right? So trying to create some type of connection with this population that has traditionally immigrant backgrounds, right? But interestingly enough, as she's trying to form this connection with this immigrant sense of linked faith, she's also moving to the center on immigration. So we saw her support the bipartisan border bill, which was one of the most conservative border bills that we've seen in the United States, right? And so it's this seeming thing that she's trying to reach out to immigrants while still kind of moving to the center on the types of policies that they enjoy. But I want to take a pause here and say that immigration isn't necessarily going to be the most important issue. And that's one of the takeaways that I want you to have. And so if we kind of look at this Pew survey from back in September that looks at the most important issues for Latinos between Democrats and Republicans, we see that the economy ranks as number one for both of the parties. We see healthcare, crime, gun policy being important. On immigration, oddly enough, we see it's actually higher among Republican Latinos than it is for Democrat Latinos, right? So we often assume that they're only going to have one policy attitudes towards immigration, but this would suggest that it's probably gonna be a little bit different, right? Because the Republican-owned support for immigration policy is gonna be interesting. So I want to kind of bring in some insights from my own research that I think helps put these findings in perspective. And so earlier this summer, I ran just a simple study with a little bit less than 1,000 Latinos. We tried to get it somewhat representative based off of partisanship, but as Professor Test was saying, polling people are hard, and sometimes you can't always get the populations you want. So we don't necessarily get it on that representative aspect. But essentially, across several different policies, I'm just going to ask Latinos a simple question. Do you think this policy would help or hurt Latinos as a group? And so not asking them their personal opinion about the policy, but how they think it's actually going to affect the group. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I'm really interested to see how different subsets of the Latino population think about Latino interests. Repeated that apparently. So I'm going to essentially try to find different clusters of these what we call group interests. I'm going to use an approach called hierarchical clustering. I'm not going to go into the details. It's a fancy term for I'm looking for patterns in the data. And so we could see that each person kind of starts off as their own observation, and eventually we try to figure out if we can find different groups within that population across these 9 different policies. But with enough of that boring stuff, let's get into the policies. And so the algorithm essentially told us that there are going to be 2 clusters that we could think about it. And we had included 4 policies with a conservative lean to it. So that's what I'm showing you right here. And so we see if we look at that second cluster, there's the only, so backing up quick. So this is going to range from -2 to 2. And any items in bold means that's significantly different from 0. And so we take that as kind of like they believe it's in Latino interests. And among the conservative leaning policies, we see that the only policy that is perceived as being beneficial for Latinos is increasing the number of Border Patrol agents on the US-Mexican border. If we look at the left-leaning policies, we see in the first cluster that they think that all of these different left-leaning policies are beneficial for Latinos. And so what I'm trying to take away from this is that Latinos do hold different perceptions of what are good for the group. We can't necessarily just assume that because people are voting for one part or another, that they're doing something that is necessarily antagonistic to the group, at least the way they perceive it. We can have discussions as to whether objectively that's true, but the way people actually feel about the politics is going to be different. So one thing we do is we try to figure out who are in these different subgroups of Latinos. And so we found a few different notable characteristics. So what we would term the conservative cluster is primarily male. And so that's consistent with some of the results that we found that was kind of drifting towards Donald Trump. We see that the conservative cluster tends to be a little bit older. But interestingly, there's not any differences between generational status. And so you might assume that those individuals closer to the immigration experience would kind of be more in that liberal cluster. But it's varied in that sense. And so next, we're going to kind of look at it based off of national origin and partisanship. And importantly, it's not just like a 0-1, right? And so in that more liberal cluster, 77% identify. And then in the more conservative one, we see that 76% identify as Republican. So we can kind of say that, yeah, that's probably a Democrat Republican, but it's not like a 0-1, right? It's not just completely average. But importantly, or at least if you're a Latino politics scholar, we don't find differences in national origin group. Traditionally, we kind of say because you're Cuban, you're going to be Republican, but I feel like these results kind of interrogate that a little bit. But what I think is most important is a lot of this narrative saying that Latinos voting for Republicans are doing so against the group's interests. And so on a scale from 0 to 1, we ask them how important is their Latino identity to them. We also ask them how important their American identity is. We also ask a few different questions on how they think Latino status in the United States actually are. So in terms of Latino identity, we see that in the more liberal cluster, they do highly identify as Latino. But in the conservative cluster, that's still 0.75. On the 0 to 1 scale, that means that they still basically think that it would correspond to somewhat important. But the 0.82 would mean like it's only slighter greater than slightly important. What's the drastic difference, though, however, is in the American identity, right? And so if we go back into how Kamala Harris was actually appealing to Latino voters, it was based off of this idea that they're immigrants. And I think as like the United States Latino population grows and more US-born populated, the immigration appeal is going to be tired. People are tired of feeling like a foreigner. They want to feel American. And I think in a lot of ways, that's what Donald Trump was successfully able to do among Latino men. There's a few other notable differences that I think are important for this conversation. In particular, we could think about system blame, which is economic individualism. How much do you think people can kind of pull yourselves up from your bootstraps? Where higher values mean that you think that the system is stacked up against you. In the more liberal cluster, we see that they believe the system is more stacked up against them. Versus the more conservative one, they think, no, people can... The reason why Latinos are the way that they are is because they're not necessarily pulling themselves up by the bootstrap. And so what this kind of means is I think Democrats need to reconsider how they're appealing to a Latino population if they hope to have that continued support. And so kind of finish this off, again, the majority of the US population is US born with a declining number that are foreign born. And so what this means for the Democratic Party...
Wait, you meant US Latino population.
Yeah. So I've been rushing. So this is like between 2000 and 2020. And they just kind of plot the total number of Latinos in the United States that are US born versus foreign born. We see that the vast majority are US born. So we don't necessarily know if they have that immigrant connection anymore. And to be clear, I'm not saying that Democrats, shouldn't necessarily be thinking about immigration. And in fact, there's an argument that among those liberal Latinos, immigration was important. So going center ended up being a negative thing. Finishing up, share of all eligible voters who are Latinos growing. It's the youngest demographic group, and so that is truly the swing voter of the future. For many who are Latino, they're still figuring out the political partisanship right now. And so it's important for Democrats to actually put in the work, or Republicans for that matter, to put in the work to kind of connect their party with that population. And we see that political parties have taken note. And so I think we need to look at Latinos in the US as more than immigrants and kind of listen to Latino voters and meet them where they are. And I think... anyways, about the American identity and Latino identity provides certain insights into, I guess, how Latino men and Latinos in general voted in this election. Thank you.
That was another excellent presentation. No pressure on Professor Richard Arenberg, who, as I said, has come on up, has 30 years of experience in chief positions in the Senate, has been teaching courses on Congress, the presidency, and American politics here at Brown for some years. So we're going to ask Professor Arenberg, hopefully, to talk about what he thinks will happen in the now Republican-controlled United States Senate and what he thinks of possible House GOP control.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for all of you for coming out on a Wednesday evening to listen to us. Where do we go from here? As Wendy said, I'm going to slice this a little bit differently, look at it from the perspective of Capitol Hill. But I want to take a moment at the outset just to take a step back and celebrate the fact that we are returning to the peaceful transfer of power, a central element of our democracy. The loser in yesterday's election called the winner, congratulated him, conceded the election. Nobody's going to invade the Capitol building. And I'm quite confident that President Biden will be at the inauguration, as will be Vice President Harris. And so I think that is a good frame with which to start, in that it's a return to the more normal American democracy. Now, one of the most, in terms of where can the president go from here, what can he do? One of the most important things that we need to learn is who controls the Congress. As we've said, the Senate has flipped over to Republican control. It appears there'll be at least 52 Republican senators, perhaps as many as 54. So a middling kind of advantage in the Senate, slightly larger than what the Democrats have recently had in the Senate. When we look at the House elections yesterday, we still hasn't come into focus which party will control the House of Representatives. By the way, if the Democrats take control of the House, as they might, this will be the first election in American history in which the House and the Senate have each flipped in the opposite direction in the same election. But it's very important to the success of any administration, particularly in our in recent decades in our highly polarized political environment. It is especially important that a president coming into office has control of both the House and the Senate. If the Democrats have control of the House going into this coming Congress, that will be an effective veto over many of the things that a President Trump would like to do. So it's a pretty crucial question. One threshold that he's already reached, as I've said, is that the Democrats, that the Republicans have taken control of the Senate. This is particularly important because, as you know, under the Constitution, the Senate plays a central role in confirmation of presidential appointments. So this is very important right off the bat in terms of the cabinet. With a majority in the Senate, President Trump will, particularly given the kind of control he has over his own party, President Trump will be able, very likely be able to put whoever he wants to put in the cabinet and do that successfully. That's not true of certainly of all presidencies, as you know, in terms of recent history. But perhaps even more important is the question of appointments to the judicial branch, particularly the Supreme Court of the United States. And here, as you know, there's already a 6-3 advantage in terms of very conservative members of the court, but at least two of them, Alito and Thomas, are at what those of you that are younger than me might think of as retirement age. Of course, they're in those positions for life. But now that there's a Republican president, they may see this as an opportunity to retire. And that would be an opportunity for President Trump to replace those two very conservative justices with two more very conservative justices who are yet much younger in age and might have 30 or even 40 years to spend on the court, which means that right now, with the configuration we have, with the Republicans controlling the Senate and Trump in the White House, right now we have pretty much the preconditions for establishing a very conservative Supreme Court of the United States for decades to come. We're basically already there. Okay, so I said it's very important to a newly elected president to have control of both houses, because if the Democrats in our highly polarized environment, if the Democrats control the House, that is a death knell for much of what Donald Trump might like to do in the Oval Office. I mean, there are some things obviously like tariffs and some immigration measures and other matters, foreign policy, where he can operate unilaterally in the executive branch. But for most significant big ticket items, he needs the Congress. And as I've said, in order for him to be effective with the Congress, he needs control, his party's control of both the House and the Senate. So let's assume for the moment that he has that the House, which looks like it may very well go to the Republicans in the next several days, let's assume that he has that. He has the unified, what we call the trifecta sometimes, the House, Senate, and the Oval Office. What's likely to be right at the top of his list? The tax bill. He's promised another tax cut. He in the closing weeks of the campaign, he emphasized a whole basket of tax cuts that were aimed at being very popular with certain subgroups of voters. And that was no taxes on tips, no taxes on Social Security, no taxes on overtime pay. Well, you add those all up, that's a whole I don't know what adjective to put on it. It's a big load, let's say, of tax cuts. Very expensive, but how is he going how is he going to do this? Now, those of you that know me probably anticipate what's coming next out of my mouth. And that is that very important in all of this is a particular rule in the United States Senate, and that is the filibuster. Those of you who know me, I've long been an advocate of retaining the filibuster in the Senate. It puts me on a bit of an island with my fellow observers on at least on one side of the aisle. Democrats would have very much in recent years kind of gone over in the direction of wanting to get rid of the filibuster, seeing it as undemocratic and so forth and so on. Okay, I'll do it quickly. I won't go down the filibuster rabbit hole too far, except to say that the Democrats in the Congress are about to rediscover how much they love the filibuster, because it is Horatio at the bridge. This is the last best hope for Democrats to have leverage in terms of Trump's political legislative agenda. So let me just go back to the tax bill for just a second, and then I'll yield the floor. I won't filibuster. In order to pass the tax cut and not have it successfully filibustered by Democrats in the Senate, he will need to use a kind of obscure set of rules in the Senate known as reconciliation. You may have heard that term before. I'll just simplify it. I'll cut to the chase. But with reconciliation, he can, with a simple majority, pass the tax cut. But the procedure to get to that will require the House and the Senate to agree on something called a budget resolution under the 1974 Budget Act, because it's only through the enactment of a budget resolution that reconciliation instructions, as they're called, can be put, create the precondition to allow a reconciliation bill to pass that tax cut further down the road. And I'll stop right there.
I'm just going to thank Professor Amberg and say that, so pointing out the filibuster is really important because it's unclear, bless you, that the Republican majority will keep the filibuster, because what it is extended speech. And you typically need 60 votes in the Senate to shut down extended speech on a legislative matter. So reconciliation is a thing invented by a Democrat, Robert Byrd, 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago. And it says you only need 51 votes to do sorts of things. Now, Trump will want the Republican leadership, whoever that's going to be, to get rid of the filibuster. He's not going to want Democrats to have the opportunity to complain about Trump on the Senate floor. And this is, I'm just going to give a roadmap of 3 things to watch, and then I'm going to ask one question to each of the panelists and open it up to you for questions. So watching how the GOP leadership consolidates its own power. So thinking about Trump, who casts a very long shadow, but you have ambitious politicians in the Republican Party in the House and the Senate that are looking ahead to 2028, 2026, and 2028. According to the Constitution, no president shall be elected to serve more than 2 four-year terms. President Trump will likely try to repeal that amendment. That's my prediction. I don't think he'll be successful. You need 38 states to do that. He won't have that kind of support. However, he's going to want to get his things passed without any kind of source of criticism for the Democrats. Will the Republican senators serve 6 years? So especially those who have just been elected, they have 6 years. That technically outlasts Trump. And they will be looking for a vehicle to make their name known to voters and donors, as Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and Mike Lee and Rand Paul have done. So start to watch for the discussions that the Republicans will start to have about who their leaders should be. There are 3 people running: John Thune, South Dakota; John Cornyn, Texas; and now Rick Scott, newly reelected from Florida. Listen to what they are saying and promising their Republican colleagues to be their leader. Will they preserve or get rid of the filibuster? Literally the last bastion. I fully agree, and have also written smaller articles on the filibuster, agreeing with Professor Ehrenberg. The last mechanism to block anything in a completely 100% controlled federal government. So I have questions for 3 of the panelists. You have exactly, I don't know, a minute to answer them. So I will start with Professor Testa, and then go to Professor Zarate, and then Ehrenberg. So for Testa, how trying to sort out the reasons Hillary Clinton lost from the reasons that Kamala Harris lost. Going into this election, we really didn't think it was the same as Hillary Clinton in the very sole identity factor of her being a woman. So tell us what you think in terms of Kamala Harris being a woman and then a self-identified Black woman. That's one question for you. General population views on women leaders. I will say that the number of female U.S. senators increased yesterday, and I, for one, am very happy about that. So Alsobrooke won, the first Black senator from Maryland, female, Black senator and female, and then Lisa Rochester in Delaware also won, also the first Black female senator from Delaware. Then Alyssa Slotkin has been declared the winner in Michigan, filling a woman that she replaced, Debbie Stabenow. And Tammy Baldwin retained her seat in Wisconsin. And we'll see if Jackie Rosen can hold on in Nevada. But the point is that the number of women was 25, and now we may go up literally by net 2, which is 27. And, considering women are 51% of the population, that is progress. So, Professor Zarate, you pointed to the fact that a common statistic now in 24 hours is that 50% of Latino men voted for Donald Trump. 2 questions. What do you estimate the overall registered vote Latino turnout was? Typically, it's about 48%. And 2, are there cultural attitudes that would reject a female leader in the Latino male community? You could easily point to the recent election of, I think it's Claudia, right? Scheinbaum. Claudia Scheinbaum in Mexico, first female leader of Mexico. And of course, we have a rich history in several countries like Argentina and Brazil of having female leaders. So is that a stereotype? And will you help us debunk that? And then Professor Ehrenberg, I would like a wager on who the majority leader will be for the Republicans, and will they get rid of the filibuster? So those are my start. And then after that, we will open up questions in the audience. Okay, so Professor Testa?
Thanks for such an easy question, Wendy. And it's a hard question to answer, right? Like, when and will America ever elect its first female president, right? I think absolutely, if you look back to the Clinton campaign, I think you can see attitudes towards sex and sexism being highly predictive of support for Trump voting against Clinton. And so now you combine that with also attitudes towards race. And I think these are longstanding issues that are confounded with any number with other factors, right? And so, like, are older white men refusing to vote for Kamala because she's a woman, or because she's a Black woman, or a woman of color, or because they refuse to vote for Democrats because they don't feel represented in the party? I think that's something that we have to tease out and ask of scholars. I suspect you'll find. I am confident. I think the other potentially interesting thing is, if you think about the campaign she ran, it's unclear to me that gender was as salient as, say, in Clinton, where I believe her final sort of, election night party was in the Barclays Center with like the glass ceiling, right? And I think Kamala was, again, this goes to the campaign she ran. I think she ran a very like clean campaign, but maybe a conservative, like a safe campaign, right? I think she didn't want to make gender and didn't want to make race salient. Had she made it salient, could she have talked about it? Like, if you think about Tolly Mendelberg's work in the race card, if she had made this explicit and we talked about race, we talked about gender in a way, would people say, well, all right, I don't want to be that guy or person? I don't have a great answer for you. It's a really important question.
No, but that's a great next day answer. And so what we're excited about is that your work and your skill set means that you'll be looking into that and giving us answers in the spring when we come back to this.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Professor Zarate?
Yeah, so I guess the first part of your question in terms of overall turnout compared to, let's say, 2020, I'm going to have a cop-out and say, like, I don't know. I spent a little bit today trying to figure that out, and I just couldn't get don't really know the numbers yet. I think time will kind of tell. But if we believe the exit polls right now, then like on average, Donald Trump will receive about 45% of the Latino vote, which is going to be the largest proportion since ever. George Bush received about like 40%, if I remember correctly, back in 2000. And that's a continuing trend among Latinos because between 2016 and 2020, we saw different subsets of the population. Again, I'm using the term subsets to say like it's very easy to kind of like generalize to the population, but it's different subsets that are moving across these different populations. So between 2016 and 2020, we saw Latinos that were primarily non-college educated and lower income shift towards Donald Trump. And so, Donald Trump kind of has that messaging kind of going for the working man. Again, we could kind of debate whether or not that's legitimate or something like that. And so I have reason to believe that shift is going to kind of continue, that particularly among non-college educated and lower income Latinos, that's probably where much of the shift goes. And then towards your second question in terms of cultural attitudes towards women, I think oftentimes like there is this stereotype among Latinos of like machismo and things like that I think acts as like an easy explanation for that. And while that's certainly prevalent within the group, I'm not trying to dismiss that at all. I don't know if it's necessarily more so compared to other racial ethnic groups compared to like African Americans or white Americans. And so do I think that played a part? Yes. But do I think it's unique to Latinos or Latinas? No, not really, I would say.
Okay, it's very helpful. So I think you're surely going to hear all sorts of things about particular groups, and it's really important to dispel any kind of stereotypic assumptions. So, Professor Arenberg.
The first part of your question is who's the next majority leader in the Senate? I think it's likely to be John Thune of South Dakota. Of course, that's not certain. They haven't yet given me a vote in the Republican caucus, let alone a magic wand, but I do believe it'll be Thune. He is, the second part of the question, will they eliminate the filibuster? I think not. Thune, at least in the past, is on record as opposing eliminating the filibuster, as are many members of the Republican caucus. During the Trump's first term in 2017, he repeatedly demanded that the Senate eliminate the filibuster, and it's about the only thing that the Republican caucus. It's about the only thing he asked of the Republican caucus in the Senate that they didn't grant him during his 4 years in office. And I think that's a pretty deeply seated view in the Republican caucus in the Senate. But my track record on predicting Republican senators, particularly in the last few years, is pretty spotty. So I'll say that with some level of humility, but I think they will not eliminate the filibuster.
That's where the majority of the senators, that'll make a difference. If there are 54 Republican senators and you include Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, Rand Paul, and Mike Lee, who love the filibuster, they love it. And then possibly Bernie Moreno, who is literally a used car salesman from Ohio, who is a very loquacious kind of personality guy, if you've seen some of those ads. You can imagine where they aren't going to want to do this. And it will be very interesting to see what that tug is. And that's why using these procedures, reconciliation solves a problem for them because Trump will be happy to get it through. And the Democrats would have passed a tax cut too, by the way. So we should all make sure we know that. Okay, let's take some questions. So if we want to, Hannah, if you could grab a mic, that'd be great. And maybe Othniel as well.
Can I just two-finger on your question?
Yes, you can.
Which is
Yeah.
that the other common feature, right, of these past 3 elections has been Trump. And I think Trump has been uniquely willing to say racist and sexist things, right, and make this salient and say it, but also say it in ways that I think are, just gesture or be ironic or in ways I think make it particularly challenging as an issue. So I do think that, like, going forward, if we think about sort of, if there's a return to politics as normal or future candidates, I don't know that they have the same ability to sort of bluster as Trump or to sort of just say so much that people can dismiss any particular thing he is saying as just that's Trump being Trump.
Yeah, and on gender, it's a very confusing picture because Kellyanne Conway ran his campaign in 2016 and became his chief sort of advisor and spokesperson, and he has and Sarah Huckabee. And Sanders. And so when you think about how he's elevated women to prominent positions to speak for him, it creates a bit of a bluster. Is that really just bluster? Is that what he thinks? Because he has elevated women to those positions. So, okay, first question. Green t-shirt? Yeah.
Hi. So my question is for Professor Zarate on the shift we saw in the Latino communities. That among the general demographic shifts, it feels on the Democratic side, where do you go from this? Seeing such large shifts, like, plus 22 in Yuma County, all of Miami-Dade and Southern Florida. What is the prospect? Is there a prospect in winning them back? Do you feel like they will shift? Or do you think that this will also come with backlash of Democrats against Latinos as well as the party reckons? Will there be a blame placed on Hispanics?
So excellent question. Thank you. So let me start off with where where the Democrat Party goes from now, and not just for Latinas. I think after this, the Democrat Party kind of needs to have a conversation with itself, the type of coalition that it wants to build. I think Kamala Harris, for the 3.5 months that she had to run an excellent campaign. She was kind of facing an uphill battle to begin with, being tied to an unpopular administration that also was coming off the wake of extreme inflation. And I think for all the virtues of that she tried, I do think that she was missing out on some different groups, right? And so I think oftentimes she was using the same type of strategy that Obama had in order to build his coalition, right? And this is a habit that I think the Democrat Party kind of has, where it's like, if it's not broke, why fix it? And so one thing I think that they're going to need to have that seems to be working for Republicans is treating them, like Americans. And so far as we know that the Democrat Party between 2008 2012 started really hammering on immigration as a way of mobilizing Latinos. And at that time, it did work. Particularly after 2006, Latinos were going through what we in Latino politics call a racialization process, where they were really trying to discover their identity, and those type of identity-based appeals work. But the thing about Latinos is it's a dynamic population, right? So we constantly have turnover. It's a very young population. So the way people are thinking about politics changes from year to year. And so I think what Democrats need to do is not think about, well, what has worked in the past, but rather what is going to work right now. In terms of are they going to end up getting the blame and what's going to happen within the Democrat Party? If we believe Twitter, which I don't know if we should, that's definitely a subset of the population, and people are already engaging in that, right? I think it's natural for people wanting to find the blame in something, to a certain extent. That's what we're all doing right here. Why did this happen? And I think it's easy to kind of blame this group that shifted from what we would normally expect, right? And so, do I think the blame is going to happen at maybe the voter level? Yes. I don't think at the political elite level it will be. I think, if anything, this election really marked how important the Latino vote is going to be going forward, because they know it's not contested. I think Democrats, to a certain extent, just took for granted that whichever Latinos they mobilized were going to vote for Democrats, and these past recent elections have proven that that's not necessarily true.
I'm gonna go to Michelle. Oh, we need. Can you? Michelle's right here. Fine, thanks.
Thank you all so much for coming here and speaking to us. I know a lot of us were trying to figure out answers and look towards the future and also breathe. So I really appreciate it. My question is also for Dr. Zarate. Thank you so much for what you said, because I think it is so easy. And, last night and this morning, I was reckoning a lot with myself and my ancestry in trying to make sense of the numbers when it came to the Latino vote. You, in your presentation, said what the Democratic Party and Kamala Harris did is try to play to Latino voters as if, they were immigrants. And that is a central part of that communication strategy. Whereas Trump made Latino voters feel as if they were Americans. My question is, how? How did Trump do that? He, based off of all of his
I think
rhetoric.
that's good. That's a good question. Let's leave it. Hannah's also working with the Taubman Center, so thanks, Hannah. And then I guess Malcolm's the next, Hannah. Yeah, and then.
Oh, we have another question?
Malcolm. No, not yet. We're gonna wait. I'm sorry. Okay.
So I'm trying to figure out how to answer this without getting into too technical of an explanation, but I'm finding it hard to do that. Insofar as, so there's a rising strain of literature within Latino politics that's based off of the social psychology principle called identity categorization. So oftentimes when we hear Donald Trump talk negatively about Mexican immigrants or Puerto Ricans, for example, we automatically assume that people are going to think that they're talking about their own group. Identity categorization, this process where we're thinking if there's some negative aspect of the group that might be associated with them, they're going to try to distance themselves from it, right? And so there's a lot of Latinos in the United States that don't want to be conceived as immigrants. And so they're going to be thinking he's thinking about us here as opposed to the people that haven't come over yet. I grew up in El Paso, Texas, in a border town. It's generally the first generation individuals that kind of talk to me about why are Democrats talking to me? Why are they only talking to immigrants? And when Donald Trump kind of talks to Latinos, he calls them Latinos. He's not saying you're all immigrants. He's just kind of saying I love Latinos, right? He's maybe not talking about policy, but he's bringing them into the conversation without also trying to I guess, not necessarily saying Democrats are doing this, but for lack of a better phrase, baby them, oh, we're here to help you, as opposed to let me tell you what I can do for you. It's a little bit different. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Yeah, I have one question here, and then we'll get to that side. We're gonna get to that side in a second.
Thanks. I'm Malcolm. I'm a sophomore. I want to ask, my question is about how much of the result of this election is a product of deep structural trends in the electorate versus the particularities of this race. So is it that people are upset about the economy, people are upset about the border, the Republicans are out, the Democrats are in, people want to change the status quo, so the Republicans were going to win? Or is it that maybe if Joe Biden hadn't decided to run, if there wasn't this whole dropout scenario in July, if there was a competitive primary and you had someone like Josh Shapiro or Gretchen Whitmer, a Democrat not closely associated with a super unpopular administration, if the Democrats had gone that way, would they have had a better chance, or was the election stacked against them fundamentally?
Yes. No, in that I'll jump in, but I think some element of both of those things are true, and it's so hard to know what, right? I do think that this was a tough election for any Democratic candidate to win, based on sort of feelings towards the incumbent, feelings about, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago, status of the economy. That said, could it have been different? We can never know. I think, maybe you could look at the Osborne in Nebraska, right? Who is sort of running as an independent, running sort of more economic populist message. I think he still lost, right? But maybe the margin was a little and so it is hard to know. I think this is the big question for the Democratic Party going forward. And I think all answers should be on the table. That's a great question.
So thank you for that question. So all the way in the back, yeah.
My name is DeMarcus Pruitt. My question was, I guess, for the whole panel, but I guess when we're describing race, to me, it sounds like identity politics more like the '90s style, where there's a certain phenotype. I agree with that phenotype. I don't, but I kind of want to push back on the notion that he made people feel like Americans. I think that using racial difference to make someone feel like an American isn't really firm ground to say that I did something in a certain way. So I think that using racial difference. His economic policy was racial difference. His immigration policy was racial difference. So I think mobilizing a populist message around that and almost saying that he was successful in a certain way goes back to maybe how our institutions understand race. And maybe be it gender and race being the same thing and class being an outcome of that. So I think that my question is the panel maybe using a 90s framework to talk about Latino politics to maybe give Trump a skate and not really go into, we have a fundamental problem with how we talk about race and politics without using a 90s frame.
So first of all, thank you for that excellent point. And I think I would like to clarify some of my language insofar as I don't know if it's him necessarily making them feel like American versus I think the Democrats often make Latinos feel foreign. So maybe I think that is a slight correction in terms of the language. In terms of I guess the way institutions understand race, I think that's also an excellent point. So one thing that's kind of unique about the Latina population is no one is truly Latino until they come to the United States, right? It's inherently an American concept. And what people make or how people understand that is going to vary by the individual, right? And so we can look into some research from the 1990s actually that finds that compared to non-Hispanic whites, Mexican Americans tend to actually endorse quote unquote American values, where they define American values based off of patriotism and economic individualism, even more so again compared to non-Hispanic whites, right? And so I think it is speaking to a value-based thing where if the Republican Party, going back into some of the figure I was talking about in terms of do they believe that the status of Latinos is due to systemic discrimination versus economic individualism, we see that those individuals that gravitated towards the conservative way of viewing things don't believe that the system is necessarily stacked up against them. And so not to go on I guess on a tangent, to return back to your question, I think it is really important to think about what we mean when we say someone is Latino, what is Latino interest, because that's going to vary by individual, right? Just as a random plug in, Christina Beltran has this excellent book called Trouble with Unity that kind of talks about this notion of shared political consciousness is constantly challenged by the ideological diversity of the Latino community, right? But there's some type of power when you come into a country and someone labels you as something. And so therefore you start framing your own interests in terms of that identity. So anyways, I just want to say that was an excellent point. I need to correct my language for that. But thank you. I wanted to
there was a woman who had it. Yeah, just right there. And then we'll get to, and then we'll go to that side and we'll go to this side.
Hi, thank you guys so much for spending the evening with us. Professor Ehrenberg, I will see you in class tomorrow for more updates. I guess I'm sort of just looking for any bright spots, any positives that came out of yesterday. There's a lot of really concerning stuff online, and I guess any silver linings or, glimmers of hope or positive things that you guys might be able to share, I think might be helpful.
Well, I can take that. In addition to a peaceful transfer of power, which you might say that's not fair, their team won, so Trump will be peaceful about it. But nonetheless, the fact that the president won the popular vote and the electoral college vote, I think is really important because they've been out of line for a while. And then people have always pointed to the electoral college as kind of the problem with American politics and American elections, that they're aligned. I think gives people who voted for Donald Trump a sense that the system does work. Elections were very smooth yesterday. And then the person they voted for won. There was no fraud. There was no cheating, theoretically, that we know of. And if you don't like the outcome, that's one thing. But to have 70 plus million people who had been told that elections were rigged and fraudulent and not legitimate and the system doesn't work, and now their team won, and it seemed to go well and clearly well, that may restore some, not all, but some of the belief in elections. And why do I think that's so important? Because if you feel like you were empowered by the result of the election, and people who supported Donald Trump felt empowered, and people who supported Republicans felt empowered, they're going to want to vote again. They're going to want to vote in 2026. And that's important for preserving elections. There's a lot going around saying he's going to cancel elections. Elections are run by states in the Constitution. Cancel elections. He's not going to have any elections anymore. He's going to get rid of it. I don't know that he won't try to do that, but the next set of elections federally are the midterm elections. Those are for House and Senate. And voters are going to want to feel empowered again. They're going to want to feel like they have a direction in their government. So the fact that it went well and Trump won for a population that had been told that elections are not safe or fair might give us an opportunity to restore faith and a little more calm approach to elections, and also help preserve the 2026 midterm elections. So I think that's not a small thing. And as I said in the beginning, more women were elected. I believe more Democratic women also, depending on how the rest of the results go, were elected. And I do think that's important, given that they're still not near even close to parity. We can debate the fact that Kamala Harris did not emphasize her gender or her race, her self-identified racial affiliation. And you could say, well, maybe she should have, maybe she shouldn't. But I got the sense, even though she lost to Trump, and Trump is this huge figure, that she was taken seriously as a potential leader. And without being in the public eye for nearly as long nationally as Hillary Clinton was. And I think that bodes well. There was Nikki Haley who ran, and there was Kamala Harris. And I don't know when we get to a female president, but I don't think that she did anything to undermine that. In fact, I think she advanced that, particularly among a lot of women who were inspired by her campaign. So I do think there are some positives. And again, remembering Professor Testa's slide, you can't rely on the government to protect your democracy. You have to rely on one another. And I think that's even more so today, tomorrow, and the rest, of the next 4 years at a minimum. Let's go with the gentleman over there. Yeah, thank you. And then we are going to take a question over here. And then we are going to give about 5 minutes to 24cast, which was the operation that predicted a 70% chance for Kamala Harris to take the election. Yes, sir.
In the lead up to this election, we heard a lot of discussion on the impacts of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on people's votes. I'm curious what you guys noted as the impact on Jewish voters, on Muslim voters, and on young voters in this election.
I'll jump in on just some of the early exit polling I had seen, right, and some of the results. So I do think that, Kamala underperformed in Dearborn, where there's I think the largest Arab population. I think she also underperformed in New York, and I think in some exit polls among Jewish voters, which you can see by religion. And so I think it was kind of pressed from both sides. And I think, being part of the administration, being part of, I think that they were less of an ability to, I think she's running different ads in Michigan than she was running in, I think, elsewhere on this issue, in a way that I think Trump could try to sell himself a little more freely on that. So I think, again, in the sort of list of explanations, I think it certainly had an impact. Was it decisive? I think there were so many other things also having an impact that I think it's hard to say. But absolutely, I think there was.
And it's something that's been, I would also say that for a very long time, even go back to the 1980s, sometimes groups decide I'm not going to vote for my party candidate or the person who's closest to me ideologically because I want to make a protest vote. I really want to I don't want someone to take my vote for granted. The calculation, if you're going to do that, should be, okay, I can live with the consequences of that. If the opposite person gets in, those policies won't be damaging to my cause. And I think that the Trump administration will likely adopt policies that are quite damaging to that cause. So I think this is the trade-off, but it's not a new one. Young people tend to do it more than other people. And it is a tool in American party politics to send messages to the party about policy. So, but it's a trade-off. And I think you'll see that trade-off probably in the beginning of the Trump administration. I have a gentleman here, yeah.
Well, thank you, professors. I have a question about sort of the Latino voters being interpolated as being Americans, and they were by one party and being immigrants by the other party. I can't help but notice that parallel with, for example, another group of people who are perpetually understood as not necessarily immigrants but foreigners, right? The Asian Americans or the Chinese Americans. And of course, I think there's certain kind of categorical similarities, right? Asian Americans index a very large group that right, it's not very heterogeneous. So I just want to know if you can speak more about a sort of parallel or analogy or disanalogy of what's going on, because is there a similar story that we can kind of, is it worth test whether or not this is the kind of thing that really swing the vote, or is there something else? Is there something that to your knowledge that's emerging, in that direction? Thank you.
So excellent question. My initial reaction is it's sort of like an empirical question. Within the broader subfield of like racial and ethnic politics, I would say like Asian American politics is probably the one studied the least, followed by then Latino, then African American, so on and so forth. I would stand to think that is the case. There's some work in psychology that kind of like looks, it's called like the dual axis subordination, where they kind of combine, think about like the racial and ethnic groups in the United States in terms of these axes of competency and then foreignness, where both Latinos and Asian Americans are just perceived as necessarily like foreign. And we know that they have a strong desire to want to like have a sense of belonging in the United States, right? Like particularly if there aren't any plans to go back home. And, we do find differences if there's an intent to immigrate back or turn back home at some point, and the sense of American identity, at least within Latinos. And so I would say it's an empirical question. We can answer that. We can just ask them like, how important is your American identity, and see how much that predicts support for Republican or Democrat candidate. I think it would kind of take a little bit of work to see how these two parties are appealing to this group, which there's not a lot. Asian Americans and Latinos compared to white Americans and African Americans have the largest, like, I guess, voter turnout gap. So the parties typically don't invest like a lot of resources into them. So oftentimes they kind of get left by the wayside, and
But turnout's relatively high in those communities, in Asian American communities. And Wendy Tam Cho she's a political scientist who has done some work on this. And there, a while back, they did sort of broke out a quote unquote original nation of origin. And they identified that there were partisan patterns within the Asian American community about which parties they supported. So, and also I just wanted to add one more thing about Rhode Island politics. Anybody from Rhode Island or, has been here a while, Latinos are the largest group proportionally of small business owners in Rhode Island. And Rhode Island has a lot of small business owners. And when you think about the Trump platform and you think about COVID and the Democratic policies, I think there's arguments made on both sides, but you can certainly see where that rhetoric on lower taxes and less regulation would appeal to small business owners. So I have one more question, yes, and then we will go to the 24cast presentation. But I am going to ask Professor Ehrenberg what the chances are that Thune gets it, like actually.
Hello. Thank you very much for the presentation. My question is, I think, for the entire panel. In terms of like applying the Trump win to campuses and to student immigrants that are already here, because we know Trump's immigration policies for future immigrants, what can we expect in terms of work visas or renewing our current student visas, or even the social license for companies and institutions to start turning away student immigrants? Like, what should we expect as immigrants who are already here but not on a quote-unquote like solid ground?
So I think that is an excellent question. And what I can say is, I hate to punt it, but I'm going to say that in December 2nd, I'm probably going to have a much better idea of what the university's response will be and where universities are thinking. But the university, the leadership of this university has already convened a working group on these very questions. So the university is absolutely on it, and they are thinking of all the possible scenarios. I will say that, and I don't know whether this will matter or not, but state schools in particular, in the very solid middle of the country and the upper Midwest, state schools have some portion of what you would call immigrant or foreign-born population students, right? They bring in a lot of students who want to come to college in America. And those state schools depend on that revenue from those students. And so Brown is going need blind for international students. So that's not something that Brown will be incorporating. But they are in states that have Republican senators and Republican House members and districts with Republican House members. And so if the Trump policy would then shut the door on 500,000 international students, let's say, that's going to have a real impact on some of those state schools. And I can't imagine there won't be some sort of request to accommodate that. So it might be, monetary, not maybe the principle anybody really wants, but I see the congressional pushback on that to be fairly strong coming from the larger state schools across these states that are represented by Republicans. So I'm fingers crossed that happens, but I will tell you that Brown leadership is on this question, and I expect them to be starting to communicate these things to students, whenever they sort of get their bearings. And you don't want to be preemptive in announcing things because you don't know what the Trump administration will do, but I know that they want to be prepared for a various number of scenarios. So it's a very good question. I am going to ask the 24 cast people. You want to come up? And they're going to explain their methodology. And then before you start, I just want to close with Professor Ehrenberg on the panel and say, why do you think it's Thune and not John Cornyn?
Why do I think?
Yeah. Why pick a guy from South Dakota? Tom Daschle was from South Dakota. He was Democratic leader. But why? And then who else was Democratic leader from South Dakota? I'm blanking. Right? Wasn't there another leader from South Dakota? No, George McGovern ran for president, right? South Dakota? Right. So why Thune from South Dakota where there isn't that much money to be raised versus Texas where you can fundraise till you drop?
Well, the money question is a funny one because I worked for George Mitchell of Maine, who was the Senate Majority Leader. And when he was running for Senate Majority Leader, everybody said, oh, he can't win. How can he raise money? He's running against Bennett Johnston from Louisiana, who can bring in all this oil money. And yet, but to answer your question, it's partially my instinct about the Republican caucus, knowing some of the characters. I think that leadership elections in the Senate are very much an inside game. Usually, I have a rule of thumb that the relationship between what's really going on in a leadership race in the Senate is inversely proportionate to how much noise it's making on the outside, for a very simple reason. If you're winning a race, it's an inside race. If you're winning the race, it's not in your interest to be shaking the boat by talking about it outside, by making news and so forth. But if you're losing the inside race, you try to create the impression on the outside that you're actually doing much better. And so you can get a lot of insight into what's really going on by kind of looking at what's being leaked, what's being written about that race out in the public.
Very interesting insight. Thank you. And thanks to our panel. Thank you so much. Sure.
Hi, I'm Ariel. I'm the head of operations. I was the head of operations for 24cast.
Hi, I'm Ashok. I was the founder of 24cast.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Professor Schiller, for hosting this panel and providing a space for students. And thank you to Professor Testa and Zarate for being on stage last night, and to Professor Ehrenberg for being part of our video at the Hay. Appreciate all of you. I think we predicted a 70% win likelihood for Harris. And I don't think either of us were expecting the election to go the way it did, truth be told. But to say that we're entirely disenchanted with the way we approach this and the way our model worked wouldn't strictly be fair. 538 in 2016, I think quite famously predicted a 70% for Clinton, who ended up losing. And I think it's, first of all, a testament to probabilities, right? 30% is not a small or insignificant probability, but it's also a testament to the fact that our model was based on history, right? We put in 20 years of history, everything from 2002 to 2024. And the model, which is a machine learning model, learned based off of that and made very, very specific tunings to the way that history moved. And I think this election was an inflection point. I think we saw a new voter, and that voter was a young voter. And we now know that young voters are voting in a more right-leaning way than I would have expected, personally speaking. I also think that we saw across the nation this huge rightward shift that, again, was an inflection point. This is something new. And for a model that was so grounded in what are these historical patterns, I don't think that was necessarily to our service in an election of this kind. But I'm very, very proud of the work we did and the outcome of our model. The purpose of this was to kind of shed a light on how election prediction works. And I would say that we achieved that. We opened up what's typically a black box, typically unknown of the approach. And we also opened up our decision desk to an audience. Some of you, I hoped, would have been there last night. So I'll pass it over to Asher to add some additional insights.
So to add a few more things, the first is I definitely was not expecting the election to go this way at all. I think that we don't predict the popular vote because that's not how our model works, but of the models that predicted the popular vote, no one predicted with anything more than a 20-25% chance that Trump was going to win the popular vote by what looks like about 1.5 to 2 points as of the current data. It might go closer to 1.5. That was completely unexpected. This was not the 2-point D+2 environment that most of the polls were showing it as D+1. It was much closer to R+3, R+4. It was a 6.5 point shift among the national ballot from 2020 to 2024. So there's a lot of major shifts. The biggest criticism that I have of our model is that while we did believe that a sweep of the 7 swing states, which looks like what is going to happen currently, was the second most likely outcome to occur, that was still a relatively small chance. We had a 7% likelihood, though it was the second most likely map. So if I were to criticize my own model from a subjective hindsight thing, I would say, well, maybe that should be a little bit higher. For the future of machine learning and election prediction, I think there is a path that involves not being full-time college students while making this. One of the first things that I wanted to work on in the beginning was to do something that no pollster, no aggregator, no forecast had ever done, which is to aggregate the crosstabs within the polls themselves. We had seen that none of the crosstabs had predicted the way that this election had gone with pretty much every single group moving right. But some of the crosstabs had seen some racial depolarization and movement among white college-educated voters. It just so happens that going back 20 years and looking at 3,000 polls and going through the crosstabs of every single poll with a team that in the beginning started with 3 people, it was infeasible. And I wish it wasn't, but I do enjoy that we've made an open source model that anyone can look at. And that I hope in 4 or 5 years down the line, someone says, wait a second, we've got another presidential election. Let's do this with crosstabs. And we're going to come out with postmortems and reports and all this sort of stuff, sort of discussing what we think could happen. But the benefit is it's open source. People can look at it. And I hope in the future people use what we've created for good.
Yeah, I'm so proud of our team. And I see some people, in particular, Rosie, and from our decision desk. What states were you on?
New England, Missouri, Colorado, Alaska, Hawaii.
Amazing. I don't know if I'm missing anyone else. Malcolm, for the GPU participation, thank you. This was a huge labor, and we're so proud of the work we've done, even if the way we predicted it and personally might have assumed it to go was not an overwhelming Trump victory as we might be seeing.
Thank you very much. And I would encourage you to go to the website 24cast to see what the components of their predictive model are. It's very interesting. And I'll leave you on this note too. If you are concerned about reproductive rights, 7 out of the 10 states adopted some form of protection for reproductive rights, including Missouri. So I would, which is a pretty red state these days. Josh Hawley got reelected easily. I would caution everybody, and I think Professor Testa started out this way, to assume that the whole country moved right on every issue you care about would be a mistake in interpreting this election. Sometimes, Jim Carville notwithstanding, it is the economy. And sometimes lots of different kinds of people will all shift in one direction because of the economy. And I can tell you, Republicans felt this way in 2008 when John McCain lost to Barack Obama. And everyone said there had been a sea change in people's attitudes. But in fact, it was really generated by a reaction to the economy. So it's going to take a year, 2, 3, maybe 4 to really see if this idea that there's been a holistic rightward switch actually happened. And because if you're seeing adoption of protection of abortion in Arizona and Missouri and some other places, Montana, actually, there were different initiatives there. So when you see that, you have to say to yourself, and not on every single issue did everybody go in the same direction. So I would take a deep breath before you make those kinds of assumptions. And I'll leave you with, again, a plug that we'll talk about this again on Monday at the Politics and Policy Lunch, and then an open conversation with the community and students on December 2nd in the Joukowsky Forum at noon. Lunch will be served. And just, if you get old enough, it's a good thing because you'll go through elections where you feel really good the next day. And then you'll go through elections where maybe you're not feeling quite as good as you like. But you really know that there's another day and there's another election. And if there are things that you care about, then you have to find a way to build a coalition to support those things. And maybe we all have to rethink who we want to invite into that coalition. All right. So thank you so much for coming tonight.